Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening, and thanks especially to any of you who have taken a moment sometime recently to recommend the show to a friend. That is how people learn about it, and that is how I come to get angry emails from all around the world, for which I'm forever grateful. I really am. Thanks also to everyone who subscribes to The Secret Show. If you like SLEERICKETS and you'd like some more SLEERICKETS, or you'd like to help support SLEERICKETS, I haven't tried the charity angle, but that's Elijah's pitch, so maybe I'll horn in on his territory too. If you'd like to send me some money and also get a bunch of extra episodes, along with access to the whole backlog of Secret Show episodes, then go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com. If you put in your email address, I will give you access to the feed for a week for free. At which time you can then decide whether or not it is worth your trouble. Either way, thank you all, and it's good to be back recording again. I was in New York for a week, which was lovely. If you want to hear more about that, go to The Secret Show, but I feel like after spending a little less than a week in the city, I'm totally qualified to make some to offer some broad characterizations of the city and its inhabitants. Specifically, I was sort of converted while I was up there on the question of New Yorker rudeness. So I have long been used to defending Southern hospitality to my Northern friends. And I think it's partly because, Southern hospitality is a little bit of a misnomer. The claim is that people in the South act nice and say things like, bless your heart, but then behind your back, they're really mean to you. The bless your heart thing is true, though people make a little too much of it. It's maybe like, it's not always mean. It's just usually mean. But the hospitality thing is not quite right? Hospitality has to do with welcoming someone in. There is, however, I think such a thing as Southern decorum, right? And what this really means is not that people are pretending to be nice, but they are acknowledging that when you are in public, you behave a certain way. That's really what it comes down to. When you're in public, you treat those around you with a certain consideration, saying ma'am and sir, and opening doors, and deferring, and smiling, and asking them how they are, even if you expect nothing but a polite lie in return. That's really, it's Southern decorum, I think. And it's not the worst thing in the world, and it's certainly not dishonest. It's just a convention. It's a behavioral convention. But I think similarly, New Yorker rudeness is not really a good way to describe the brusque attitude with which your fellow subway riders or the clerk, the barista at the coffee shop treat you when you give them a Southern smile and a big long slow diphthong laden question. The speed and the impatience of New Yorkers, for which they are famous, what I came to understand with the help of David, one of my oldest friends and a longtime resident of New York City, is that New Yorker rudeness is really just a modified sort of goodwill. Now that's really what it is. I mean, as he would put it, like, if you are going to bother to talk to a New Yorker on the street randomly, then it is assumed that this is for some reason. With Southerners, you talk and smile and exchange pleasantries for no reason, or simply for the reason that you are in public together. And that's what New Yorkers don't have patience for. But I came to really appreciate that, given the extreme density of the city, the impatience cuts both ways. That is, you are not afforded sort of basic pleasantries or courtesies as you brush past people on the street or have a brief conversation with a clerk at a store, but neither are those pleasantries expected of you. And as someone who has never been especially good at Southern decorum or remembering how to behave nicely at a neighborhood barbecue, I kind of appreciated that it's a sort of a generosity. It's a sort of negative generosity. Like, it's not expected of you to, take the time to smile and say hi and nod and acknowledge everybody around you, it's understood that we all have shit to do and we can all just get on our way. However, what's also true is that if you actually need something, New Yorkers can be extremely helpful. I mean, I witnessed personally on a number of occasions the willingness of New Yorkers to voluntarily do favors large and small for those around them when there was a specific point. And then just as quickly, as soon as that favor had been completed, to leave without a word, which is kind of nice. I mean, I'm a big fan personally of the Irish goodnight at parties, just leaving. I think the Irish do it because they're drunk and don't remember to. I just like to leave. But I realize there's something fundamentally autistic about New York etiquette. And I think I'm sold. I think I like New York goodwill in lieu of hospitality or universal courtesy. All right, so enough on that. This is a sort of a big, juicy episode this week, and it's one I suspect will be like I did a big abortion episode with Alice. I mean, abortion and like men and women and women's rights and power and sex. I did a whole big messy episode on that, which you are welcome and encouraged to go listen to. But this week I thought I would offer you an episode on the moral opinions of Friedrich Nietzsche, or as I like to refer to this topic, abortion for men. I mean, it's not really fair. The person who actually introduced me to Nietzsche was a brilliant female philosopher, Elizabeth Bryant. I don't know if she's still teaching, but she is. If she is, go take a class with her. She's amazing. We follow a few poetry related paths, and we do come back to poetry at the end of the long conversation, but mostly it's about a book called On the Genealogy of Morals, which was one of Nietzsche's later books. I think it's totally worth reading. We talk a lot about why many people don't like Nietzsche. A quick note to, just because I know I have a lot of Christian listeners, I don't think we say anything disrespectful about Christianity, though Cameron Cameron might come close a couple of times, but I think we are sort of taking it seriously. I will just offer the possibly infuriating in itself opinion that one of the reasons that Nietzsche has been, in addition to sort of falling out of favor with the left in recent years, one of the reasons that he has long been especially hated by Christian intellectuals is not simply that because of his harsh rhetoric about Christianity. He is pretty harsh. He has some pretty mean things to say about Christians and Christianity. But I would say, unlike, say, Christopher Hitchens, who was a delightful writer, but sort of an asshole when it came to religion, and would title the book, to subtitle the book, Why Religion Poisons Everything. Christopher Hitchens liked to engage in the Dozens style riffs about the badness of Christianity just to entertain himself. Nietzsche's threat, I would say, and the reason he has angered so many Christians across the decades, or century and change at this point, is actually not so much because of his mean names for Christians, but because his criticisms have some teeth. And that's what we are going to get a little bit into in this episode. I talked to Joanna a little bit about this early on, and despite her complete lack of interest in philosophy and active negative interest in Nietzsche, it at least seemed to hold her attention for the length of a brief walk with our anxious dog. So if that's all I can offer you, then I will consider it a victory. But I think you will enjoy this. This is a conversation I had with Cameron. At his prompting, he read the genealogy recently for college, or as they call it over there, uni, and I was really glad to have an opportunity to come back to it. So I'll get to that now. And Christians, we love you all.
you sent me an email yesterday,
Hmm. Oh yeah,
titled
yeah.
or titled Auden, with a quote from the dyer's hand, which you put in the sentence before it. This reminds me of you. And I'm paraphrasing, but the first sentence is, "It does not matter that much if the young poet fails their exams," or something.
Right.
Very funny. I'm still slightly confused which part of the quote you sent to me really like reminds you of me. So I wanted
Yeah. I'll
clarification.
pull it up because it's a nice little passage.
It was a fun passage.
Okay, so yeah, this is a passage from Dyer's Hand. I think I was in the middle of writing it. I was in the middle of reading the essay, so I think I wrote reading the Dyer's Hand, and I came across this passage that reminded me so much of you. I had to send it along, so I stopped reading to type this up and send it to you. He writes, "It is
Okay.
hardly surprising then if a young poet seldom does well in his examinations. If he does, then either he is also a scholar in the making, or he is a very good boy indeed. A medical student knows that he must study anatomy in order to become a doctor, so he has a reason for study. A future scholar has a reason because he knows more or less what he wants to know. But there is nothing a would be poet knows he has to know. He is at the mercy of the immediate moment because he has no concrete reason for not yielding to its demands, and for all he knows now, surrendering to his immediate desire may turn out later to have been the best thing he could have done. His immediate desire can even be to attend a lecture. I remember one I attended, delivered by Professor Tolkien. I do not remember a single word he said, but at a certain point he recited, and magnificently, a long passage of Beowulf. I was spellbound. This poetry, I knew, was going to be my dish." So yeah, I mean, it reminded me of you in a few directions. One is that your work at like you're like smart and you've done well in school. I don't know how you're doing at Oxford, academically, but the impression I get is that there's like a slight friction between the demands of writing academic papers and your inclination to read and write furiously in this sort of slightly different mode. Like you would like to me like your way of writing is closer to like a Nietzschean rant than it is to a sober, Foursquare academic paper. And then the other
Yeah.
part that just felt like, he talks in that section also about just like how he had a high old wild time at university and horribly wasted his parents' money. But he also says like he says that he fell in love with just listening to Beowulf, even with like limited understanding, and he doesn't remember what Tolkien was saying about Beowulf, though Tolkien was supposed to be like a wonderful Anglo-Saxon scholar. This just reminded me of like the way you sort of will fall in love with the texture of poetry and be, you're not a sentimentalist when it comes to lyric content, but you are a sentimentalist when it comes to like the beautiful fabric of a well-written poem.
No, I like that. You flattered me and slipped by the failing the exam part. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, I like your assessment of me and the piece. And yeah, I agree. There's a great there's a big friction between me and the academic course.
Yeah,
But
I
I
mean,
mean,
at least like you sent me one of your papers, and I was like, I don't know what his teacher's going to think of this, but like I enjoy it. It just doesn't seem to be much of an academic paper.
well, yeah, that was one of my more experiments because I
Yeah.
mean this term is the term to experiment because next year is going to be like a fuck ton of actual essays that will contribute towards my final grade. So I
Mm.
thought I'd fuck around with this term.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, Auden left with was it a third? He left with like the lowest, one of the lowest marks you could get. So
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
aiming to leave with maybe like a second. Maybe if I can leave with
Yeah,
one higher than
that
Auden, it'll
seems.
be fun.
I mean, at least in the U.S., it truly doesn't seem to matter what grades you got. It only matters where you went.
Yeah, I think it matters a little bit more here, but I definitely think Oxford, if you go to Oxford or Cambridge, that will matter maybe more than the grades. Although, people always say to us, if you go to Oxford and Cambridge, every job's open to you.
Right.
But
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
lot of my friends are doing internships right now, and the economy is so stultified that it turns out not many jobs are open to most people. So,
Right. Yeah.
we'll see.
they're as
Um,
open to you as they are to anyone, but
right, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But let's continue our sort of delicate dance around the central issue. And let me bring
Yeah,
up
yeah.
my second point,
Okay.
which is sort of a Matthew Bryan-esque moral discussion,
Okay.
which you can also cut from the podcast if you think it's just too egregiously offensive.
Okay,
But
good. I can't wait.
so, as you might know, I met with Alice Oswald
Hmm.
again 2 weekends ago, whatever, doesn't matter. 2 weekends ago, Saturday, at 10 a.m., she emailed me and said, "Let's meet at 10 a.m. in the sunshine." And I was like, I did have the heart to say that I'm normally not awake at 10 a.m. So I dragged myself out of bed
You can
at
get
9.
up early for the,
Yeah.
poet laureate or whatever she is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, there's one person I'm gonna get up early for.
Yeah.
Probably should be Alice Oswald. So I got up early and went to see her. She came into Worcester again. And so I saw her. I've already met with her once last term, so about 3 months ago. And we
Mhm.
had a discussion, and she came into Worcester and, my college, and
Mhm.
we sat around and talked. Anyway, she came again, and we met in the same place. But she had brought her husband and her son, her adult son, who then said, "Oh, I'm not interested in poetry," which I find very, very funny. And
You
like,
brought them
of
to
all,
meet with you?
yeah, well, so her son was with her and said, "I'm not really interested in poetry. I'm just gonna walk around the lake." And to be fair, like,
Okay.
my college is the nicest college in Oxford in terms of a rural appearance.
Okay.
So
All right.
everyone wants to walk around the lake, so that's fair.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
On a side note, I think it's like, of all the poets to have as a parent when you're not interested in poetry, I can imagine that Alice Oswald is probably not the easiest.
Right. She
But
seems to like breathe poetry.
yeah, 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 yeah. And I kind of want to be a fly on the wall, like in their domestic situation or something. Like it would have been so interesting. But anyway, so she brought her husband, and this is where sort of my offensiveness comes in. So her husband is a playwright, right? So he's a
Mhm.
number one. He's a playwright. He's not about he. So he joined us. He was going to talk to us. He talked to me. I talked to her and him, right? So she said, "Do you
Mhm.
mind if I bring my husband along and he can join the conversation?" Yeah, and I said, "Sure, of course." So if you look up her husband, I'm sure like you'll find him. But also he's like infinitely the less popular one out of the
Sure.
two, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this brings me sort of to my moral dilemma, which was he knows he knows, and maybe he knows that I know that I've come here to talk to his wife, right? I've come
Yeah.
here for Alice. That's who I'm interested in. But if she brings him along, I now have to do sort of like, I'm interested in this sort of delicate dance I have to do now of paying him enough attention that my sort of central interest doesn't come off in sort of just an utterly dismissive, out of control manner. And it went totally fine because I just talked to both of them, and they got me to read out my translations of Mandelstam, and then we talked about Mandelstam for a while, and then I read out two of my own poems, which probably came as terrible comparisons to Mandelstam. And we talked as a trio, but I'm just interested in like how he must have felt, you know, coming
Yeah.
with his wife, who is, not adored, but like, is the person all these students, or maybe not just me, but like the
Right.
person a
Yeah. Yeah.
random student at a random university wants to talk to and is, fascinated by. I
Yeah.
wonder like what his psychology is. And I wonder if he at all feels, if his diminishment in popularity compared to her at all aggravates him, or if I'm
Mm,
just overthinking it.
I think you're overthinking it. I mean, for one thing, you had the existing relationship with her, not
Mm,
him.
mm,
For another, she's a poet and professor of poetry, and you're writing, translating, talking about, interested in poetry. You're not writing plays. You're not a drama student. So I think if he were your playwriting teacher
mm.
and then you expressed interest only in talking to his wife, the famous poet, that might be a little irksome. But I mean, I think like I am by far the less popular of the two writers that make up the marriage, which like I'm in. And I certainly have talked to plenty of people who had lots of interest in my wife and no interest in me, at a much lower level in this, obviously. But like, I don't know that it will bother him that you, a poet, are more interested in her and poetry. I think the other thing to keep in mind is like, depending on the situation, depending on the conversation, how it goes, whatever else, like he may still have things to offer despite not being famous. But I don't think I
Oh,
would
oh yeah, he
worry.
did.
Yeah.
And like I'm not at all trying to insist that because he isn't famous, he's of less value to talk to. I'm
Sure.
just sort of
Yeah.
interested in his relationship. And yeah, I think you're probably right. And maybe if
Yeah.
you keep this sort of reveals more about my own sort of psychological
Yeah.
insecurities, and
I mean,
maybe.
what I mean, let me ask you this: like, what was it like talking to the two? Like, what was it like for you talking to the two of them?
Oh, it was fine. I just had to sort of I sort of cut Alice from my questions, in like the word Alice. So I just addressed my questions plurally to both of them. I mean, also, I think it's interesting because so you and Joanna are very specialized. Well, so Joanna just writes prose, right? And then you do write prose, but I imagine
Yes.
you're more known. What you're known for is your poetry.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say I'm more known for my poetry because I'm not really known for anything.
Right,
But
but in the niche circles that you are known.
yeah, I mean, I've published a handful of short stories, and I've written several, unpublished novels. But yeah, so no, I mean, I have no footprint as a prose writer. I did for many years write plays and produce them, but after we moved here, we sort of basically left the place where it was possible to do that. So I don't, I don't do that anymore. But even then, I think like we both had books of poetry come out the same spring, our first books of poetry, and hers has been reissued in a new edition, even though she
Really?
stopped
Oh,
writing
okay.
poetry immediately afterward, and has no interest in it. Hers is still like beloved by many people in particularly informal poetry circles, in addition to coming up to me at the Newburyport reading and telling me that like the best part of the podcast was her. Somebody came up and said that like as many people have said like, oh, I like her poems more than yours. It's like, thanks, I'll let her know. And that's happened many times. Like many people have told me that. I mean, that was like Alex Pepple wanted her to be the featured poet in an issue of Able Muse and settled for me with her interviewing me. But like what he wanted was her to be the featured poet. She just said like, I stopped writing poetry years ago and don't have any interest in it. So yeah, because he went from like, could Joanna be the featured poet to could you both be the featured poets to okay, fine, but she needs to be prominently featured in the interview.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think like it is not only that she is like has made a reputation for herself in prose, it's also that even in the genre she abandoned, she's still more successful than him.
That's interesting. I mean, if it makes you feel better, I never heard of her, even after I heard of you. As a poet, I've heard of her
Yeah, but like you only heard
plenty
of
of.
me through what, the podcast? I mean, or through but you only heard of
Yeah,
that through Eratosphere. So right. I mean,
yeah, but I'd have thought I'd have heard of her for a Radiosphere because that's where the formal poets like to
sure, but that's not but like
love each other.
my guess is that she comes up randomly in an Eratosphere conversation about as often or more often than I come up randomly in an Eratosphere conversation, right? Like that's
Yeah,
not,
I guess
yeah,
so. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
not saying much.
I
Uh,
mean, yeah,
yeah.
who are the people who do come up randomly in a Radiosphere conversations? Wendy Vidlock or Vidlock and
Okay.
A.E. Stallings come up
Yeah,
most of
I
the time.
imagine
Mm.
so.
Well, I'd be curious to
Yeah.
I'd be curious to read her poems only because I'd be curious to read poems of someone who then seems very dismissive of much poetry and says that she doesn't understand, like it, or likes it, or doesn't like it when it doesn't make sense. Also,
Yeah,
I'm
I don't want to speak
that's what
for
she
her, but
said.
I think she's being a little hyperbolic when she says that. I think more accurately she got sort of disgusted by seeing lots of terrible poetry praised and just became much more interested in reading and writing fiction.
Oh,
She's
okay,
like
that's
she
interesting.
still will occasionally read a poem or two and have a thumbs up thumbs down thought about it, but I think
Hmm.
I think it's just not as fun for her.
Okay. We probably delayed enough.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
should we hit
So,
it?
yeah. So you recently wrote about the first. So on the genealogy of morals, it's one of Nietzsche's later books. I read it back in college and then reread it a few years ago. And then you mentioned that you'd read it recently and you wrote a paper about the first part. And so I said, hey, I should reread it so we could talk about it. It's divided into three essays. The first one is on good and evil versus good and bad, and the second part is on guilt and the conscience, and then the last part is on asceticism. We're only going to talk about the first part today, the good and evil versus good and bad. You also, should we start with, you sent me shortly before this an essay from The Guardian that came out a few years ago, the title of which is Far Right Misogynist Humorless question mark Why Nietzsche is Misunderstood. And then a little essay by a woman who had written a biography of him called I Am Dynamite, in which she argues that these three claims about him are very inaccurate, and he's been much abused and misappropriated by bad actors, chief among them being his wife and Hitler, sorry, his sister and Hitler. But so yeah, tell me why you sent this, because I have a couple thoughts about that.
Like most essays from The Guardian, it's quite cute and naive. Um, but
Yeah,
it, I mean, it's accurate. The question is true. I almost said Hitler, Jesus. Nietzsche is very greatly misunderstood
yeah,
by almost everyone. In the same way, Emily Dickinson is misunderstood by almost all literary critics.
mm.
Nietzsche is hugely misunderstood by most people, including the woman who writes the article. But
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, if you get a chance, or if the listeners get a chance, I'm sure you won't because I have a much less busy day than you all have. But if you get a chance, reading through even the comments to the article is hilarious because you come across so many people, you get across like clearly like far left progressives who really dislike Nietzsche, and
yeah, yeah.
right wing people who also really dislike Nietzsche, and then a small group of people who are trying to argue for Nietzsche. But so the article argues, as the title implies, that the three big things that are um, thought of when you think of Nietzsche, his anti-Semitism, his misogyny, and his humorlessness, which is not, which is kind of as a big thing thought about Nietzsche is kind of new to me, but sure,
Yeah, I don't remember anyone saying. I mean, he's incredibly
yeah,
funny. Like
he's
he's
hilarious.
often he's like very funny while being very offensive. So
Yeah,
I think that seems like a bogus accusation.
yeah.
It
It's
also,
also
it seems like it's not like because I would have said, instead of far right, like racist, like that's the big claim, racist slash anti-Semitic. But she specifically focuses it on being far right, which seems like a kind of a strange way to frame it.
I don't think it's strange.
Okay.
Do you know what Reddit is?
Yeah, I know what Reddit is. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what sort of the meme slash vibe of the Reddit user is?
Well,
You
this
know
is
how
the problem, because I've asked a few different people, and it seems like Reddit is so huge that it encompasses like several different kinds of Reddit users.
yes, so Reddit is huge, but one of the central stereotypes, or maybe slightly helpful depictions of the Reddit user, is sort of
Mhm.
as sort of a mixture of sort of a semi or very sort of weak, not as in weak as in physically weak, but a kind of weak incel slash kind of right wing man who is intelligent or obsessive about some subjects, but is typically sort of a social dropout and
Okay.
is therefore prone to sort of right wing and arrogant views on society.
Right.
This is sort of the image of people who like Nietzsche. I'd say sort of the Reddit stereotype has certainly infected Nietzsche in the popular consciousness. I think.
Okay. All right.
Do you think of it roughly
So
feasible?
that it may be new. I have not thought about the stereotype of him being that he was right wing. I mean, it makes sense in that he is often associated with fascists, but I tend to think of it more as in terms of like people think he's a eugenicist or he's a racist or he's an anti-Semite. But sure, yeah, I mean the right wing thing, like fine. I like, you know.
Yeah, obviously you suck too. What I mean, he's also associated with sort of the pop culture fools like Jordan Peterson, right? Who are on the right of the spectrum and who
Right.
claim sort of Nietzsche as their sort of as like intellectual proof that they are
I
sort
I
of free
keep
thinking.
I keep stumbling into little like clips from or references to Jordan Peterson, and I just find it like it's like Shane with like Andrei Rublev, except it like instead of being delighted and narcoleptic, it's just like I like anytime I hear something about Jordan Peterson, it's so boring. Like he seems boring. Criticisms of him seem boring. Like he just seems like this black hole of boringness that I can't. I don't understand any arguments about him. It just seems like why is anyone paying attention to this man?
Oh, I mean, he is. He is. That's very true. He's also a black hole of sort of middle brow political fever on both
Okay,
sides, from his
all right,
supporters and his fools, for his supporters and his attackers. But yeah, so Nietzsche is sort of associated, I think, in the modern common consciousness with people
mm-hmm.
like this. But I think
Right,
it's funny because I think one of the reasons she says humorless in the title is that she needs to easily prove at least one of the three things before equivocating. And it's very
right,
easy to actually prove that Nietzsche was humorless. It's much harder to prove the other two things, the misogyny and the anti Semitism, wrong,
yeah,
which is what she fails to do.
right, yeah.
Um,
She definitely fails at that. Yeah,
so, so she talks about the misogyny. She references an early proto feminist Nietzsche was involved with, who Nietzsche was friends with, who he had dreams of setting up a school for free thinkers with, where women
yeah,
would be allowed in. And she also references a time when he served as classics professor, I think, or professor of philosophy in a university, and he was one of
yeah.
the few people who voted to let women in.
Yeah, I
He's
mean,
all,
her argument that he's not a misogynist is basically like some of his best friends were women,
yeah, right, yeah,
which is
yeah.
like fine, sure.
Mm.
He
But also
also,
has
I
a,
can't remember if I
yeah,
want to say
it's
maybe
the
in
gay
Beyond
science,
Good
I
and
think.
Evil, he has, because I read that right before I read this, and he's it's like either in that or in one of these books of his I read relatively recently, he has a whole chapter devoted to nothing but insanely offensive statements about women.
Oh
Like
yeah, and
it's
also in
just
the
like
gay science, yeah, he was
like is it in the gay
aphoristic.
science? He has like I mean
Mm.
he has like little tossed off things, but he also will often just have these whole big chunks of text that are like, and let me tell you about women, and it's like I don't know how serious it is. I don't know how like could he have meant that in a fit of anger and also been friends with these feminists? Like sure, I don't know. I don't know what was in his heart of hearts, but like he definitely said some super misogynistic stuff. Like that's not really up for debate.
Yeah, so let me tell you about two things I've read about Nietzsche recently
Okay.
that have really come to color my thinking on such matters.
Okay. All right.
The first one, which is more vague to this, but we can sort of return to throughout, is a statement Nietzsche wrote, I believe I can't remember in which book, sort of, I think of a middle period, when he said, there has been no philosopher whose essence has been as close to music as mine has been. And I do think often of as Nietzsche's writings as music, as opposed to philosophy,
Hmm.
or as music like as philosophy can reach. And the second one is that Nietzsche was very obsessed from an early age, very much like Salan. Nietzsche was very obsessed with Shakespeare, as most Germans seem to be. Most German sort of
Hmm.
romantic-esque writers seem to be. He read all his plays. He bought a collected edition. I can't remember if it was in German or English. And I think Nietzsche really loved in Shakespeare, and you can see in the genealogy of morals, also in Homer, he loved sort of the mask-like nature that these writers could take on that sort of you couldn't find their true central ideological core. You could
Yeah.
simply find the masks of the characters that they take on in each play. And I've learned to read Nietzsche in this way.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you what Nietzsche's central philosophical message is. And I think to read
Mm.
Nietzsche like that is a mistake. You can read
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Schopenhauer and Hegel like that. You cannot read Nietzsche like that. He is Shakespearean in his attitudes, and you see this massively in the genealogy of morals. But it's
Yeah.
totally unsurprising that he can say that in the gay science he can imagine the horrors of a woman who is of women who have been bred to be fearful and sort of virginified away from sex and then
Yeah.
forced into marriage where sort of the sexual act is sort of the conquering violent arm that their husband wields against them. He
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
this and also spout sort of this pseudo-rational, pseudo-spiritual bullshit. I think at times it is accurate if you just remove women and just put people or like humans in. But if you just say women, then it's bullshit. It's pseudo like
Yeah.
aphoristic bullshit about the shallowness of women.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same book because Nietzsche is
Yeah.
Shakespearean in his masculineness, and it's both. It's beautiful in it's beautiful in it of itself, and quite terrifying when you take something like women. And the same thing goes for Jews and Jewishness, but we can get to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
my sort of thoughts.
I think, yeah, that rings pretty true. And certainly in reading one of his books recently, I read through a chapter and I like underlined a bunch of it. And it's like, this is really I mean, I often underline stuff of his not because I agree with it, but just because it's really well said or it really gets at some idea I'm interested in. But I'd underlined a bunch of this, and then I got to the end, and like it ended with close quotes and like says the so and so, and it's like, wait, what? Like all of this was like you ventriloquizing somebody and saying this is the kind of thing this other person would say. So I think like your suggestion that we read all of his writing in magic quotation marks is probably not a bad one. The slight adjustment I might make to it, and what's also true, and he says this at times explicitly, that he's trolling the reader, that like he is trying out saying things he doesn't believe in a way that may provoke readers to think some interesting things. Like he is almost writing like one half of a Socratic dialogue where it's not so much that there is an absolute conclusion drawn. It's more like listen to somebody speaking in this way and have your thoughts stirred by that. And maybe the truth lies somewhere beyond it. But I think what occurred to me reading the genealogy this last time was that it is not so much that one gets it, like reading book after book after book of Nietzsche. I have not gotten a better and better sense of his larger philosophical system or view. And I think she says something to that effect, Sue, what's her name, in this Guardian piece, that it's not that you necessarily get like a comprehensive sense of his vision of the universe, but what I think you do get is a better and better sense of his personality, at least his personality as a writer, or his voice as a writer, as a thinker. And it is where I think the masks and the dramatic monologue model of reading is maybe a little bit incomplete, is that I think he often does ventriloquize. He often does like pick up a role and play it out to see where it goes. But I do think that overall you get to hear this marvelous voice hold forth, and often it contradicts itself in one section, when you read it next to another. Often he changes his mind. Often one book to another will have like certain similarities and certain, differences. He will return to the same subject, but sometimes, even in repeating himself, he will change his mind a little bit. What it reminded me of even more than like philosophy books or dialogues or like a play is sermons or podcasting. Like it's like you get to hear. I mean, with a sermon, unfortunately, it's always circling around the same basic message, and typically a preacher doesn't contradict himself one sermon to the next. But at least with the podcast, what you're really getting is you're getting this personality. There is real thought happening, and there may be something like a loose vision overall, but one week to the next, there might be, you might change your mind. You might be a slightly different person. You might be spurred to talk by a different thing that has come up. I mean, I do think a lot of his writing seems to be inspired by encountering idiots, like encountering like one type of idiot versus another type of idiot. And he does, like, as with certain kinds of rants, you hear him, he'll say like, let me tell you about the Jews, but then he'll say like, oh, but just in case you misunderstand me, let me tell you about the anti-Semites. And he'll be like, the English are the worst. The only people worse than the English are the Germans. And like he loves having a topic to go off on, but it's not that all of his going off builds up to some perfectly thought through system. It's more just that you get a better and better sense of this incredibly rich and delightful and contradiction and fault ridden personality.
Yeah, yes, I like all of that. Coleridge said about Shakespeare that Shakespeare was myriad minded. I think this is true of Nietzsche also. Nietzsche sort of plays, and returning to my music metaphor, or Nietzsche's metaphor that I've taken to use for
Hmm.
my own.
Yeah.
Um, Nietzsche plays variations upon sort of the brilliant myriad-minded ideational qualities of his own voice, and his voice
Yeah.
often becomes sort of the under voice. When you were talking about, you can hear his voice bleeding through. His voice is sort of the under voice, the under rhythm to all these masks and voices he takes on and these opinions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
obviously, it's not Nietzsche isn't a dramatic monologuist as Browning is, and he certainly
Right.
isn't as dramatically dissolved as Shakespeare is. But I think it's often useful to hold those comparisons in mind when reading Nietzsche because his under
Yeah.
voice thickens beneath all these voices. I
Yeah, and
think,
I think like when encountering like one of his sections that may be a little bit exasperating, like Walter Kaufman in one of these books I read like has a whole note about like, oh man, it was such a drag translating the section on women because it's just so dumb and obnoxious. But I think like the maybe the exercise to perform if you're going to read him is like ask yourself whenever you encounter like a section that seems particularly prickly or antisocial, like is there a thing to be gained by listening to the voice of this particular section? Like, is there something that I can take from it? Not because I agree with the argument at all, not because I agree with anything that the guy says, but like, is listening to this voice holding forth on this topic, does it help illuminate anything to me? And I think that, there are few sections in which the answer to that is really no, nothing.
yes, yes, totally. Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah. And I
I
think you're
think,
right that like he wishes desperately that he were a musician, and if not a musician, a poet. And unfortunately, he thinks he's sort of a poet, but he's really neither a musician nor a poet. But yeah, he
well,
definitely aspires to music, I think.
I think he's not a musician or a poet in terms of genre or craft, but I think he is a musician and a poet in terms of prose. He's a
Yeah. Oh
musician
yeah.
and
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
poet
Yeah.
of prose.
Oh yeah.
Um,
He's That's the other thing about like the people don't give him credit for it. Like he's a marvelous writer. He's just a delightful
yes.
writer.
Yes, I think Nietzsche combines a talent for sort of philosophical, psychological insight with a genius for language in a way that, say, Jesus Christ did
Mm.
2,000 years ago. And just like um, Jesus, who has been massively misinterpreted and mischaracterized by everyone,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm gonna completely enrage the many Roman Catholics that listen to this podcast, but I think this is true. Jesus massively misinterpreted by everyone, especially in character more than in comment. Although I don't think many people really live up to what Jesus's real comments were.
Sure. Yeah.
So Nietzsche has been misinterpreted. I do sometimes think that Nietzsche and Jesus probably had a very similar personality. I think they both seem to be wildly exemplary writers. But
Mm-hmm.
that's my sort of half-baked comment on the matter.
Yeah.
Um,
You wonder if the difference between them was like obviously you like culture and era and history, but you also wonder if like climate didn't have something to do with it. Like Nietzsche had that temperament in the snow, and Jesus had it in the sand and palm trees, and maybe that was part of what how
right,
they turned
right.
out differently.
Well, like he says in Zarathustra, doesn't he? Zarathustra, he says, like what gave the winter sky its sort of dull grayness? Did that give my mind? Was the winter sky? Did the winter sky give my mind that grayness, that coldness, or did my mind give the sky that coldness?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think, yeah, definitely. But I think also I can so see that Nietzsche wants to be Jesus in this text. He even has a bit. He has like a God, the ultimate. I'm paraphrasing. He says the ultimate paradox of God dying upon the cross, and I think there's like you can feel the jealousy in that phrase. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
Nietzsche wanted. I mean, there was obviously a reason Nietzsche had to invent sort of his own Bible, his own Zarathustra, and imagine that into existence because I think Nietzsche wanted to be crucified for his comments by the anti-Semites and by maybe by the Jews as well. But I think Nietzsche so desperately was jealous of Jesus. But should we talk about this essay? Should we
yeah.
try and like explain it?
So it's pretty short. I mean, the whole book is short, and this essay is it's only like 25-30 pages and paperback pages. He starts by talking about English psychologists and how they have done a terrible job of explaining morality. Like, where did we get literally the genealogy of morals? Like, where did we get the idea of what was good and what was right and what was wrong? And he spends a couple of pages talking about how wrong they are and how dumb they are, and how they've gone down the wrong road. But then he starts, I think, and this is sort of where he gets into some of the meat of what he's really interested in. He says, the signpost to the right road was for me the question, what was the real etymological significance of the designations for good coined in the various languages? Like, if you go back through deep into the roots of different languages, what does good really mean? Like, what are you talking about when you say something is good? I found they all led back to the same conceptual transformation, that everywhere noble, aristocratic in the social sense, is the basic concept from which good, in the sense of with aristocratic soul, noble with a soul of a higher order, with a privileged soul, necessarily developed. A development which always runs parallel with that other, in which common, plebeian, low are finally transformed into the concept bad. So goodness, etymologically, historically, he says, always tracks to the noble, the aristocratic, the higher social order, and badness tracks to the lower social order. And a classic split demonstrating this that I've always been interested in is the split between the gentle and the mean. If you hear how those words are used in like Shakespeare, it really demonstrates this relationship that if you are gentle, or you are a gentleman, you are one of the gentles, you are, you were raised with plenty of resources, you were probably physically larger because you got to eat enough, but you also, because you had more than enough, because you were raised in conditions in which you were not constantly subject to a desperate competition, a desperate struggle for existence, you could be taught more than just how to survive. You could be taught things like manners. You could be taught to consider others. You could be taught to be gentle, to be a gentleman. That you're gentles in the sense that you're gentility, but you're also taught to behave well, to behave like a gentleman. And that if you are low-born, you are low, you are mean, meaning small. If you're mean, you're small. And so literally, you didn't have as much to eat. You were lower. You were smaller in the social order. You also couldn't afford to be generous. You couldn't afford to be merciful, gentle, to make allowances for others. You had to scrap for every bit that you could get your hands on, and that made you mean socially. It also made you mean morally. And we can make lots of arguments about why those are not correct equations, but I think he makes a pretty decent case that they are historical equations.
Yeah, I think yes, that is exactly true. And I think this is what to bear in mind also of Nietzsche is that too often Nietzsche is read as a prescriptivist when he's actually a descriptivist.
Yes,
and I think this is very plain in this essay.
Yeah. Throughout this section, it becomes clearer later, but like, I think what is easy to do reading, especially this first essay, it's very easy to start nodding along with some of the things he says, and then believe that what you're nodding along with is, and so this other kind of morality is bad, and we need to stick to the noble, the old-fashioned, the gentle, the great, aristocratic morality. And that's really not what he's saying. He's saying, here's how it came to be. And it has advantages and disadvantages, and furthermore, it's not that way anymore, and we can't wind the clock back. The distinction he makes finally is that, like, basically, way back when, the aristocrats, those who had power, wealth, privilege, strength, beauty, all of the good things, all of the obviously good things, what they said was good was themselves. Like, to be somebody who has enough, who is powerful enough, who is rich enough, strong enough, beautiful enough, wise enough to do what he needs to do, to have what he wants to have. That is the person who can be generous. He can be hospitable. He can afford to be forgiving in a meaningful way. He can make agreements and keep his word. He can be honest. And that's what defines good. And so good is the beginning of value for the aristocrats, for the nobles. And after that, you say, oh, well, I guess not having those qualities, I guess being not those things, that would be bad. So bad is sort of passively negatively defined. By
Yeah, bad
contrast,
but not evil.
yeah, bad but not evil. And then by contrast, I want to try to find the section because it is really striking when he talks about the where the idea of barbarism comes from, which is pretty chilling. Well, yeah, okay, I'll hold off on this, but basically he says, like, if you are the nobles, then you make sure to always to treat the other nobles well, to be basically, like, if you have to be a true enemy to a noble is to be respected by that noble, right? You are an equal. You're somebody who is opposed in equality, but it also means you can have things like intertribal customs where, like the custom of hospitality, being a good host or being a good guest, the custom of observing certain, religious rites, the custom of observing certain blood standards. These are the sorts of agreements. These are the sorts of standards. These are the sorts of values that can only exist among those who have plenty. And then those who don't are nothing to you, they're not evil to you. They're not your enemy. They're just beneath you. And part of being beneath you means that you can also disregard them utterly, and sometimes with horrible viciousness. You can essentially vent your spleen on them. And he says that basically the idea of barbarism is when nobles cut loose and butcher the villages of people who are not nobles, they become to the not nobles barbarians. But of course, barbarism is, to the nobles, anything that is outside of themselves. He basically, what he defines though is that if you are not a noble, if you are not one of the big ones, one of the great ones, one of the powerful ones, if you are small, if you are poor, if you are weak, then you start not with what is good, you start with what is evil. And what is evil is the nobles, because they do whatever the fuck they want to you, because they are cruel, because they are powerful, because they have what you don't have. And so you start with that and you work your way backwards to good, until
Oh,
good is what we are, is the absence of that noble evil.
yeah.
You want to
Well,
interject?
no, I was going to say, was the extract you were looking for? Does it begin with, or does it contain the words "in all the voluptuousness of victory and
Yes. Where is
cruelty"?
that?
Yeah.
Where is that? Yeah. What's the
Hard for me to
number
tell
section
you.
that's in? Oh yeah,
Um,
hard for you. Okay.
Fuck, I just
That's
did
that's all
word
right. That's right.
search. I'm
Yeah.
gonna
Do you want to
try.
read that? Do you want to read that section? Oh, I think
Uh,
yeah, I think of it. Yeah. Do you want to read that section? I think I found it.
the problem might because I was reading, I told you I was reading two translations simultaneously, and the Holub translation is on Audible, but I just downloaded the Kaufman translation off the internet, and there's just weird like numbers in it where it's sort of
Oh, okay.
mistranslated the word into Braille, so I might have to pause a
Okay.
little, but I
All
can
right.
try.
I think I have it too, but yeah, go ahead and see if you can read.
Okay,
Or yeah.
so yeah, he says about the barbarians and how they're seen by the people, their victims, in all the voluptuousness of victory and cruelty. All this came together in the minds of those who have suffered from it, in the image of the barbarian, the evil enemy, perhaps as the Goths, the Vandals, the deep and icy. Oh wait, actually, we don't need that. Actually, I don't think so. But yeah, so the voluptuousness of victory and cruelty. What a
Hmm.
lovely phrase!
Yeah.
Came together to form the barbarian in the minds
Yeah.
of those who suffered them. And
Yeah.
he talks later about them enacting sort of great acts of rape and murder and walking away from it as one walks away from student pranks, which
Yeah.
is a brilliant metaphor.
Oh yeah.
Just
No,
excellently
it's
put.
yeah.
Amazing, amazing
Yeah.
work. But
Here's
yeah,
I think a helpful paragraph. He says, "Here there is one thing we shall be the last to deny. He who knows these good men, the nobles, the aristocrats, he who knows these good men only as enemies, knows only evil enemies. And the same men who are held so sternly in check inter pares, like when they are among peers, they are very they adhere to strict moral codes because they respect their peers, and it's important to them to maintain order by preserving laws between them. But the same men who are held so sternly in check inter pares by custom, respect, usage, gratitude, and even more by mutual suspicion and jealousy, and who, on the other hand, in their relations with one another, show themselves so resourceful in consideration, self-control, delicacy, loyalty, pride, and friendship, once they go outside, where the stranger is found, they are not much better than uncaged beasts of prey. There they savor a freedom from all social constraints. They compensate themselves in the wilderness for the tension engendered by protracted confinement and enclosure within the peace of society. They go back to the innocent conscience of the beast of prey as triumphant monsters who perhaps, and here's the passage you're talking about, who perhaps emerge from a disgusting procession of murder, arson, rape, and torture, exhilarated and undisturbed of soul, as if it were no more than a student's prank, convinced they have provided the poets with a lot more material for song and praise. And that, I think, it's similar to the student pranks. They're cutting loose from, in one context, maybe in the classroom, they have to be very severe in their self-control. And so they cut loose among those who don't matter to them, who are beneath them, with just acts of absolute horror. And so I think this is where it becomes clear that he's not saying, and so we should be nobles. He's saying, this is what has happened. This is where these ideas have emerged from.
Yeah, of course. And I think any close reading or anyone who pays attention to the tone of that text will be able to tell the massive, great, gleaming, glaring voice of contempt that runs through that entire passage. Contempt runs through much of Nietzsche, but it runs through that passage beautifully. It runs perfectly in the phrase "the blonde beast," which he uses. Which
and he uses the blonde beast. At least Kaufman, I think, makes a pretty good argument that when he says the blonde beast, one cannot fail to see at the bottom of all these noble races the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory. I think that was a phrase that the Nazis seized upon, and they in fact they edited versions of this book in order to make that phrase more prominent and to obscure the places where he complicated that phrase. But in the same, in the next sentence, in fact, in the same sentence, he just has a semicolon. In the same sentence, he gives examples of the blonde beast, and he includes Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese, and Scandinavian Vikings. So he's talking. This is not about Aryans or Teutonic races. This is about noble races who indulge their savagery in invent that violence on those they consider beneath them.
Yeah, he's taken a racial feature and transferred it metaphorically into a spiritual feature. I think it's almost hilarious that the Nazis did this, because even with covering up the particular passages that are more contemptuous of the blonde beast, it's such a contemptuous phrase in itself. That it's hard for me to read that phrase without laughing. He's clearly laughing. The blonde beast is at the bottom of his contempt as much as sort of the slave morality is. And it's such a beautiful symbol of the alt-right. To this day, the alt-right continues to fight the right and the left. I mean, the left is foolish in another way, but the right continues to function in this way, in their utter self-deluded interpolations of reality that mock them even as they attempt to create them out of sort of texts that they clearly don't understand. I think this is sort of a beautiful summation, a beautiful characteristic of one problem with the right, not just the alt-right, but even just the right wing in general, even conservatism. I think there's a beautiful summation of its inherent problem through the ages to our very day. But Nietzsche.
Oh, and just a quick note that I think supporting your claim that there's some contempt in that phrase. For one thing, I think Kaufman's suggestion is that he's not even talking about Aryan blondness. He's talking about the lion specifically. But in German, the phrase is even more ridiculous. The phrase is blonde Bestie, which is it really doesn't have the severity and dignity that I think Hitler might have dreamed of.
Yeah. Before we go on to sort of the slave revolt, I want to draw us back just to like a hilarious passage.
Yeah.
When he talks about the psychologists, and like if any of you still
English
doubt,
psychologists.
And if any of you still doubt that he is humorless. He's talking about these psychologists. At the beginning, he says, I found this book that I read with perfect happiness and perfect disdain. Or there's a paraphrase, but something along the line where he's read this book by this English psychologist.
He just takes delight in hating this book.
Yes. In this passage I'm about to read out, he's puzzling over why the psychologists have started thinking about value judgments and why they've sort of started to disbelieve sort of the purely Christian idea of what good and evil means. So he says, what is it really that always drives these psychologists in just this direction? Is it a secret, malicious, vulgar, perhaps self-deceiving instinct for belittling man? Or possibly a pessimistic suspicion, the mistrustfulness of disappointed idealists grown spiteful and gloomy? Or a petty subterranean hostility and rancor towards Christianity and Plato that has perhaps not even crossed the threshold of consciousness? Or even a lascivious taste for the grotesque, the painfully paradoxical, the questionable and absurd in existence? Or finally, something of each of them, a little vulgarity, a little gloominess, a little anti-Christianity, a little itching need for spice? But I am told they are simply old, cold, and tedious frogs, creeping around men and into men as if in their own proper element, that is, in a swamp. And I mean, it's a perfect example of of Nietzsche's working himself up into sort of this fury of excitement. You know, are they these? Are they sort of following my spirit? Are they sort of?
It's a priamel, not this.
Are they luxuriating in contempt? No, they're just frogs, and they're cold and uninteresting, jumping into men's minds. And you know, it's such a beautifully worked piece of craftsmanship, as well as a hilarious piece of craftsmanship.
I mean, that's the where he has he has like, in a way that rivals like Shakespeare's great insults. Like he has a real gift for malediction. Like I mean, and he loves getting pissed off about something and just as you said, like building up a head of steam, enjoying the process of tearing into every inch of this thing that he despises. So should we talk about before we get into the phrases that really set people off in this book, master morality and slave morality? Should we talk about ressentiment, his sort of weird French pseudo concept, or it's a real concept, but it's it's a little bit. It came up actually in Champagne Sharks recently. Like it's sort of a weird.
Really?
Yeah, it basically, like, I think Trevor was told by somebody else that this was a meaningful concept that he had been talking about in the context of what he calls black blue checks on Twitter, but he, without having read Nietzsche yet. So there is a pretty good note, I think, that Kaufman gives on why he didn't translate it into English. So in the original German, Nietzsche uses this word ressentiment and uses it a lot in this book. And where's the passage? And so
he used it so much so that when I came to write my essay about it for my exam last year, I just kind of got obsessed with it and just littered it through the essay. And I had to come back and like cut loads of it out. So I just found out I'd written like ressentiment like 100 times. It's a nice word to say.
Yeah. So I'm trying to. He has a good passage on the translation of it, but maybe he doesn't include it in his shit.
I got something to say while you look. If you
yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say back to what we were talking about, barbarianism, and how the barbarian is not placed in any is not a moral value judgment of the good, the nobles. Is a moral value judgment of its victims. This, I think, perfectly illustrates or really plays into something Elijah was talking about recently with you, when Elijah took issue with Homer, and what Elijah sensed was Homer's sort of lust or almost zeal in the violence of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how Elijah was saying that he couldn't stand Homer, or not, he couldn't read Homer comfortably in several passages for this reason. And Nietzsche uses Homer in this essay, but Homer is certainly of that kind of noble writing in much passages of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you can see that sort of noble barbarianness flowing through the Homeric poems. Of course, Homer's genius is that simultaneously he has the myriad-mindedness of Shakespeare and can come up these things from like there's like empathy and a joy in violence sort of glow simultaneously in Homer, and it's such a pleasure to read him because he unites these things as as Shakespeare and Seneca also do, but Homer is a sort of a brilliant, glowing, violent, and yet empathizing example of this, I think. And Nietzsche must have read Homer for it. Nietzsche reads Homer really well.
Yes, and I think like I won't attribute this to Elijah, but I do think that some of the criticisms of the Iliad in particular as glorifying war make one really fundamental mistake, which is that obviously Wilfred Owen's portrait of war is a true one. Like, war is horrifying. It is, without dignity. It is monstrous. It is, the close up and revolting destruction of bodies. But also, war is glorious. Like it's like Homer isn't glorifying, but like there is a genuine thrill to be had in these events. And it's not to say that they're not also horrifying. It's just that both of those things are true at the same time, as you're saying, that he's myriad minded. And so if to depict Achilles finally 20 books in, finally coming to the battlefield and just cutting a ribbon through the Trojans, just going to town on them. I mean, it is so thrilling that to depict it as anything other than glorious would be an error. It's just that not to depict it as anything other than glorious, but not to depict it as also glorious, I think would be a huge, huge error and would actually be inaccurate. I think, you don't just hear this from poets, you hear this from soldiers. There's something, that is obviously war is horrifying. Obviously it damages people. Obviously it is better when there is not war. Not war is better than war, but also soldiers consistently they get addicted to it. It is thrilling. It is exciting in a way that nothing else is. And I think that's part of what Homer is giving. He's giving that experience its due, as well as saying, and that you're watching some mother's baby just get butchered, and it's horrifying.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Blake has the final words on this when Blake says, in contraries lies true friendship, and everything lies in contraries. Homer unites the contraries of war brilliantly, and Nietzsche disunites the contraries of opinion hilariously. But Homer is Homer is a full and great artist because he can stand both contraries beside each other and speak about them, uniting them with authority, which sort of the minor poet cannot. But okay, did you find?
So I found this section. This is from Kaufman's introduction. He says, speaking of intelligibility, why does Nietzsche use the French word ressentiment? First of all, the German language lacks any close equivalent to the French term. That alone would be sufficient excuse for Nietzsche, though perhaps not for a translator who could use resentment. Secondly, and this is again, like, when in doubt, the answer is spite. Secondly, Nietzsche's emergence from the influence of Wagner, who extolled everything Germanic and excoriated the French, was marked by an attitude more Francophile than that of any other major German writer, at least since Leibniz, who preferred to write in French. Nietzsche saw himself as the heir of the French moralists and as a good European. So part of using French language, because he does use some French words beyond ressentiment, part of it is like a fuck you to the German nationalists. And then I think he goes on to say, one is tempted to add that the kind of obscurantism he abominated involved irremediable ambiguities which lead to endless discussion, while his terms, whether German or foreign, are unequivocal. Like, he actually does bother to define ressentiment. He's not just trying to obscure his meaning. That is true up to a point, but not quite. This is Kaufman again. Nietzsche had an almost pathological weakness for one particular kind of ambiguity, which, to be sure, is not irremediable. He loved words and phrases that mean one thing out of context and almost the opposite in the context he gives them. He loved language as poets do and relished these revaluations.
That's tremendously insightful. That rings so true.
And Kaufman is like, as a translator of Nietzsche's middling verse as well as his prose, like, Kaufman is just a really, really gifted translator. Like, I mean, you see it even if you don't read his footnotes where he patiently explains not only which mistakes previous translators made, but like how they worked themselves up to that mistake because he so understands the text that he can imagine how the other translators made the mistakes that they made.
Yeah, yeah.
He's got, yeah, I mean, he's just really gifted with all this stuff.
Remind me at the end of this for me to send you his translation of, I think, Rilke's last poem, because
Yeah, yeah.
he does it so well. It's like reading a great poem in English. Like
Oh
it's
yeah.
tremendous, tremendous.
No, that's wonderful.
So remind me to coming up,
But yeah, so we should talk about what resentment is,
and we can probably get to the big
and the
matter at stake with that, right?
yeah, this is related to the problem of defining morality, starting with badness rather than starting with evil rather than starting with good. Right. The nobles define good versus bad. The people under the nobles define good versus evil, and they start with evil and work their way back to good. Good is the absence of all of these evil things, whereas for the nobles, good is the presence of virtues. So he says, "Hear a word in repudiation of attempts that have lately been made." This is Nietzsche from section 11. Hear a word in repudiation of attempts that have lately been made to seek the origin of justice in quite a different sphere, namely in that of ressentiment. To the psychologists, first of all, presuming they would like to study ressentiment close up for once, I would say this plant blooms best today among anarchists and anti-Semites, where it has always bloomed in hidden places like the violet, though with a different color. And as like must always produce like, it causes us no surprise to see a repetition in such circles of attempts often made before, to sanctify revenge under the name of justice, as if justice were at bottom merely a further development of the feeling of being aggrieved, and to rehabilitate not only revenge, but all reactive affects in general. To the latter, as such, I would be the last to raise any objection. In respect to the entire biological problem in relation to which the value of these effects has hitherto been underrated, it even seems to me to constitute a service. All I draw attention to is the circumstance that is the spirit of ressentiment itself, out of which this new nuance of scientific fairness for the benefit of hatred, envy, jealousy, mistrust, rancor, and revenge proceeds. So ressentiment is the feeling and even the worldview that gives rise to a desire for justice emerging out of hatred of those more powerful and more fortunate than you. That those at the bottom of the social order hate those at the top of it, not only because of their barbaric behavior, but also because they have and we do not have. And so resentment, in this particular context, is that spirit that creates a desire for order that is based on an inversion of an existing order. It is not.
Yeah.
It is not itself original. It is a reaction to something that already exists. The nobles don't hate those below them. The ones on the bottom hate the nobles. The nobles look indifferently at those beneath them. But ressentiment tries to build a legal, a moral order out of the hatred for those underneath, the hatred those underneath have for those on top.
Yeah. Today it manifests in the least violent ways in white people trying to cancel people on Twitter, and in more violent ways, the alt-right trying to kill people in real life. But this is another brilliant, insightful piece, which I think probably leads us on to good and evil. And we now explained evil, but it leads us on to the slave revolt in morality.
Yeah.
This incredibly controversial notion that Nietzsche comes up with. Do you want to explain it, or shall I?
Yeah, you take it up.
Okay, you leave me the most controversial bit. So Nietzsche talks about, as we talked about, Nietzsche talks about the nobility and their barbaric infliction of themselves upon sort of their victims, the mean, the lowly, to use the archaic words that define them. But he then talks about the switch in morality, which he identifies with the death of Jesus Christ, who he sees as the ultimate revenger of the slave morality, and the revenger of the Jewish nation of Israel. We can talk about the politics of why I talk about Israel at the time of Jesus' death another time, but Jesus stands as the revenger of the Jewish nation, which are the priestly people, the original priestly people. These are the victims of the nobility's unthinking barbarism, whose revenge is the rise of this prophetic figure who preaches. I'm not even sure that he would say that Jesus particularly preaches the priestly morality, but in Jesus's death, he enacts the central tenets of the slave morality. That is,
I mean, and in some of, I mean, like in the Beatitudes, and and saying the last shall be first and the first shall be last. That this image of the rich man in hell and the leper in heaven. These are the Nietzsche would say, like, the fantasies of slaves, of those on the bottom of the social order, hating those at the top, hating, in this case specifically, the Romans, and saying everything you are and everything you say is good, that is actually what is bad. And everything we are, meekness, weakness, sorrow, being bereaved, being, patience, being willing to turn our cheek, these are, rather than being signs of meanness or smallness or pitifulness, these are actually virtues. And the absence of all of
of God.
Right. Like he says that it is, even a line like, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Like this is very much in keeping with Nietzsche's description of slave morality. It is a morality that inverts an existing order. And, again, he's pretty careful about describing, not prescribing. He doesn't say, and this is always bad. He says, here's where it comes from. And it becomes resentment. It becomes more poisonous over time. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, he becomes prescriptivist towards the end, but you're so right. I think the hilariousness of it is that I can imagine most of those lines of Jesus said somewhere in one of Nietzsche's books, maybe in Ecce Homo, because that's the more insane one. But I can imagine most of Jesus's aphorisms being a Nietzschean aphorism, and I do think that Jesus and Nietzsche are incredibly similar thinkers.
They would have, they definitely would have. It's not so much that, like, I want to have dinner with Nietzsche or Jesus. I want them to have dinner with each other.
Yes, I feel like they'd either have sex or kill each other. Is like how I'd put it crudely.
So that was the first half of my conversation with Cameron. If you would like to hear the continuation of our conversation, during which we get into, at long last, master morality and slave morality, as well as a kind of, I think, a pretty interesting exchange about what exactly defines art in contrast to essay writing or monologuing or philosophizing, or whatever, however you want to think about it. We do talk about that at some length, and I think I learned something. So maybe you will too, or you will at least have fresh reasons to write angry emails to me, all of which I welcome at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. If you'd like to reach Cameron, his email address is, as always, listed in the show notes. I'm going to be putting the second half of the episode up in the next couple days. And with any luck, I'll be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.